Hello, this is Professor Setka, and today we'll be talking about race, ethnicity, and Native Americans. Now I begin with a cautionary reminder that words matter. Names have power. Sometimes words and names get used interchangeably when they shouldn't be. And this is especially the case when we're talking about terms that have racial associations. Sometimes people use these terms without understanding that they are problematic. For example, there is a sports team called the Redskins. Many of you have heard that team's name before. You may not have been aware of the fact that the term redskin is an extremely offensive, pejorative term. So sometimes these terms are used out of ignorance, and sometimes they're used quite simply because we haven't been taught why they are wrong. Now, what is race? Well, biologically, there is only one race, the human race. Race is a term that anthropologists don't like to use because they recognize the nature of racial groupings as being silly. All humans are essentially part of a species continuum of physical characteristics that developed as part of adaptations to particular environments. We are one species equally capable. Still, anthropologists, but especially sociologists and political scientists, recognize that people categorize rightly or wrongly based on these physical characteristics, often attributing positive and negative assessments to them. Now we transition from the term race to the term ethnicity, and these terms are often confused and used interchangeably, which is wrong. An ethnic group is a collection of people distinguished by others or themselves primarily on the basis of cultural or national characteristics. Ethnic groups share 5 main characteristics: unique cultural traits such as language, clothing, holidays, religious practices, a sense of community, a feeling of ethnocentrism, the idea that, your culture is somehow special or the best, right? Ascribed membership from birth. You are born into an ethnic group. You can't necessarily choose to become part of an ethnic group. And it's distinguished by territoriality. So that is occupying a distinct geographic area by choice and or for self-protection. Now, how important are race and ethnicity in America? Well, race permeates every social, cultural, and political institution, every relationship, and every individual. It is part of our individual thought processes. We seem to be compelled to think racially, to use racial categories and meaning systems into which we've been socialized. By this I mean that we are trained from a very early age by our parents, by our elders, etc., to think along racial lines. Now, this isn't always ill-intentioned, but it's part of how we see the world. Race and ethnicity are the basis of hierarchical ranking in our society, with dominant groups holding power over subordinate groups, and with dominant groups having the best of matters. Now we need to pause a moment to distinguish the terms race, racialism, and racism. There is a big difference between these terms. Race is defined as the categories people use and how they are formed. Racialism is sorting and thinking about people by categories of race, and racism is acting out on the basis of racial categories. Now, while race and racialism may be unfortunate, they are not bad in and of themselves. It's what they lead to that is problematic. In other words, when race and racialism are actualized, when they become racist, they are negative. So we move now to prejudice, right, which is kind of the outcropping of thinking about race and racism in general. Prejudice is defined as literally meaning to prejudge based on some set of criteria or characteristics, generally in a negative way. Gordon Allport defined it in a more formal way as a negative attitude based on faulty generalizations about members of selected racial and ethnic groups. So think about how these stereotypes abound. We're going to read about many stereotypes about Native Americans in the documentary that you'll be watching, Real Injuns. You'll probably become even more aware of stereotypes that are commonly circulated in our society of which you may not have been aware. Think of sports names, which is a debate we'll be getting into next week. The Atlanta Braves, the Cleveland Indians, the Golden State Warriors, the Washington Redskins, Chicago Blackhawks, Kansas City Chiefs. Think of the images, gestures, and attributes of the mascots. And if you aren't familiar with sports, just do a quick Google search on Native American mascots and you'll see what I'm talking about. Racial prejudice like this is often called racism. That is a belief that some racial or ethnic groups are superior or inferior to others. And racism may be subtle or overt. So now we move on to discrimination. Whereas prejudice is an attitude, discrimination involves actions or practices of the dominant group members that have a harmful effect on members of a subordinate group. Prejudice often, but doesn't always, lead to discrimination. Now, the severity of discrimination can vary. And this is well demonstrated by the history of the dominant society toward Native Americans. Genocide is the most dramatic form and is the deliberate, systematic killing of an entire nation or people. Now, although this term didn't come into common use until after World War II as a way of describing Nazi policies against European Jewry, the actions that the United States government took against indigenous populations on this continent are certainly genocidal in nature. Individual discrimination consists of one-on-one acts by members of the dominant group that harms members of the subordinate group or their property. So these are, isolated incidents committed by individuals. Now we move to different kinds of discrimination, institutional discrimination. So institutional discrimination consists of day-to-day practices of groups, organizations, and institutions that have a harmful impact on members of subordinate groups, but often is carried out by individuals belonging to those organizations and institutions. We have 4 different types of institutional discrimination. The first is isolate discrimination. And this is harmful action intentionally taken by a dominant group member against a subordinate group member. So, for example, a judge who gives Native American defendants harsher sentences for drunk driving than white defendants. We have small groups discrimination, which is a harmful action taken by a limited number of dominant group members outside the accepted norms of the community. So this might be, a handful of cops on a police force who have a demonstrated record of acting in discriminatory ways toward minorities. Next, we have direct institutionalized discrimination. This is discrimination that is organizationally prescribed or community prescribed action that intentionally has a differential and negative effect on a subordinate group. So this would be, for example, excluding people from public accommodations on the basis of race. So, for example, there are still certain towns in South Dakota where Native Americans are not allowed into certain bars or restaurants, right? Or in Los Angeles, the practice in the 30s and 40s of not admitting Jewish members to country clubs. You may think of Jim Crow laws in the South. Right? And then finally we have indirect institutionalized discrimination, which refers to practices that have a harmful effect on the subordinate group members even though the organizational or community norms have no intent to harm. For Native Americans, this could well be the establishment and maintenance of reservations, right? But this is a complex issue. So I want to just close this presentation by offering a few examples of statistics that demonstrate ongoing institutional discrimination against Native Americans. More than 1 in 4 Native Americans currently live in poverty, and this number increases based on which state or reservation you're looking at. For example, in South Dakota, something like 60% of Native Americans live in poverty. According to the Labor Department, the Native American unemployment rate in 2014 was almost double the national rate, which is higher than any other minority group in the United States. Indian children are placed in out-of-home care at a rate of 3.6 times greater than that of the general population. And by this, we mean the system, the foster care system. Rates of death from a variety of causes is considerably higher for Native Americans than for the general U.S. population, including alcoholism, which is 579% greater than the general population, tuberculosis, which is 475% greater than the national population, and diabetes, which is 231% greater. So some additional statistics, and these touch on a variety of different issues affecting Native American communities that you will be encouraged to explore and write about for Essay 2. You may be interested to know that suicide rates in reservation communities are more than double the national average, and Native teens experience the highest rate of suicide of any population in the United States. So this is something of a public health crisis, if you will. In 2004, the national graduation rate for Native American high school students was at 49%, lower than any other ethnic group in the United States. I don't believe that this number has increased substantially since that date. Infant mortality on Indian reservations is reported to be double the national average. And the Pine Ridge Lakota Indian Reservation in South Dakota has the highest infant mortality rate in the nation. And I believe that reservation is the 4th largest reservation in the United States, so that is a significant demographic. And finally, Native Americans are overrepresented in the prison system. And a 2014 report by the Centers for Disease Control found that police kill Native Americans at almost the same rate as African Americans. So you may be left wondering why you don't hear about these issues. They're not widely reported. And this kind of connects to the notion of invisibility that we discussed in relation to James Wilson's prologue for The Earth Shall Weep. This is an issue that we will be exploring further, why it is that Native Americans are so marginalized that the average population, or the average person rather, doesn't have an awareness of these issues. And we aren't taught to care about them. So continue reading, continue writing, and I will speak with you again.